Hello everybody, it's George from Ireland. So welcome back to my channel. Here I am in Brixton, London. And so here in this borough, south of the River Thames, you see the house where Dr. Havelock Ellis lived for the latter part of his life. So he was born, if memory serves, in 1859 in Croydon, which is now considered part of Greater London, but was then in the countryside several miles south of London. So he was in a reasonably well-off middle-class family. His father was the captain of a merchant ship, and indeed his maternal grandfather had also been a captain in the merchant navy. So he heard stories of far-off lands, which may have influenced his very broad-minded outlook, and he realised that things didn't have to be the way they were in Victorian Britain, that his father regaled him with tales of the South Seas and so on, where people were libertines. So Havelock Ellis, he went on several voyages with his father as far away as Australia and indeed Peru. And so one of them, he actually stayed in Australia for a few years, whereas he worked as a teacher. He had no higher education. That wasn't required in those days because almost nobody went to university, but he was obviously a very erudite chap, largely autodidactic, and he was fluent in French and German, having gone to a trilingual school in Wimbledon, London. But and he even had to briefly work as a headmaster when he was a very young man because the incumbent had died en poste. Anyway, he eventually came back to the United Kingdom, and he was fascinated by sex, although it seems that he didn't have sexual intercourse until he was a very old man. Remember, things were very repressive in those days. Sex outside marriage was very much disapproved of, not quite illegal. Unwed pregnancy was thought to be utterly disgraceful. Homosexuality was vigorously prosecuted under Labouchere Amendment. A Liberal MP, Henry Labouchere, whose house I filmed in Twickenham, in the Criminal Law Amendment Act, he put in this extra clause. The original law was nothing to do with same-sex relations, saying that any sexual contact between two males was a felony, and previously there had to be proof of omission of seed, or what they then used to term sodomy. So this broadened the definition of gross indecency and indeed stiffened the penalties. So Havelock Ellis thought that really, I mean, anything should be allowed so long as it was between two people who were adults who actually really knew what they were getting up to. Surprising his fixation with this area of life, considering he had no experience in it. And books that we would regard as kind of mild, as sort of matter-of-fact biological books, were often banned under the Obscenity Act in those days. So, but he decided the only way that he could speak about sexual matters without being prosecuted was to qualify as a doctor. So he returned to London, and he enrolled at a hospital which was then affiliated to King's College London, because until the 20th century doctors usually studied in a hospital, not in a university as such. Well, obviously they had some lectures in the academic stage as well as learning on the job, but the clinical and the preclinical stage were not strictly separated back then as they are today. And of course there were no help with the government with fees, no student loans, but he had family money, so a bequest was made in his favour, so he was quite lucky about that. Anyway, so Havelock Ellis, he duly qualified as a doctor, but he almost never practiced medicine, and he spent most of his time writing books, and he was very sympathetic to homosexuals, and that term had been coined by a Hungarian author in the 1860s. Often they're known by the opprobrious terms like sodomite and catamite, depending on whether they played the active or passive role, but of course plenty of people would be AC/DC. Anyway, so though he thought it was a ghastly term, it was better than something which was intended to be degrading. And so he wrote about such matters, became notorious in some circles. Incidentally, he was brought up in a family that was communicants of the Church of England, but he appears to have had no religious beliefs himself. His books in these matters, they influenced some people, and indeed, for example, the authoress of the Well of Loneliness. Anyway, he was an outcast from much of polite society, but he was on the edge of Bloomsbury circles, a man of advanced political opinions, but he wasn't specifically known so much for being an ultra-liberal or a socialist or something like that, but he socialised with people of that ilk, who were very inquisitive, thought that the world didn't have to be the way it was, and that really people should be emancipated, that things were very oppressive for all sorts of people whose activities were forbidden. But he got married to a woman who was an early day suffragist, and they had an open marriage. She was very frank about being bisexual, and was having liaisons with other men, which didn't seem to bother him one whit. He was a willing cuckold, and it's suggested by one source it was 60 before he'd actually had sexual intercourse. They had no children. So that's Havelock Ellis, who died here in 1939. Maybe almost typical late Victorian eccentric. His views would have been seen beyond in those days, but they're not outré anymore, because the so-called extreme becomes mainstream. He was a eugenicist, and many people of left-wing and liberal views in those days was worried about the fitness of the race. I don't think it was actually racist, but just the human race generally, about unfit mothers and feeble children being born and so on. Remember, people didn't really worry about overpopulation those days because the Grim Reaper sorted that out. Infant mortality was very high back then, but just that those who were born and grew up should be physically and mentally fit. Otherwise, humanity would be degraded in its breeding stock. So those who were unworthy of having children ought to be sterilized even against their will, which I know is regarded as scandalous by most people these days, but was widely accepted. He knew Margaret Sanger, the American proponent of eugenics and contraception in the early 20th century, and there's a claim that he had an intimate liaison with her, but obviously that's unproven. So you could dip into some of Havelock Ellis's writings. So here he is. Ironically enough, he's right across the street from the police station when he was often in danger of being prosecuted for obscenity for his publications, for these days things which would be seen to be rather mild and not published with any intention to titillate, which would be strictly scientific. So he argued that homosexuality was not a disorder, it ought not be criminalized and so on, that it was perfectly normal in some people. It was very much a minority orientation. It was not something that needed to be corrected. It was not a pathology. So he was almost a century ahead of his time in arguing that, and it met with general unacceptance and widespread condemnation at the time. But these days, if you were to argue for the opposite, of course, you would face a chorus of execration. Anyway, so that is Havelock Ellis. Thank you so much for watching my channel. So please make sure you subscribe to me on Patreon and donate on PayPal to me, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Because obviously I urgently need donations to keep the channel going. So that's for me outside Dover Mansions in Lambeth, London, and whereof I was speaking, that is the cop shop right there behind me. Anything else I can say? Well, obviously I'm a tour guide here in Londinium, so I know you want to hire my services for that, and tutoring people in all sorts of subjects in GCSE, International Baccalaureate, A-Level, and what would I say, English as a foreign language, IELTS, the Life in the UK test, academic IELTS in particular. That's the International English Language Testing System, and being a tour guide in London, you know, just organising one with some people for this summer already. So get in and book whilst you can. You can email me via my channel, gcallahan with a triple N @gmail.com. So gcallahan, GCALLAGHANNN @gmail.com. Right, toodaloo.